And Sweet and Amir Fryman, welcome back to the Mystical Positivist.
Thank you so
Hello.
much for having us.
Nice
Well,
to
it's
see
great.
you again.
It's great to have you and to share this conversational space with you. So this is an unusual show in that instead of us inviting guests, although we have, of course, invited you, each of you individually in the past to speak, you guys sort of invited yourselves to talk about a particular set of issues, a related set of issues. And that's intriguing in and of itself. So I'm glad to have you both back on the show under the circumstances I've just described. And I'll turn it over to Anne Sweet because I think she has the energy to get us started. And then she can turn it over to Amir, and it'll be a mutual creation after that.
Great.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Thank you. Well, I'm not sure where to start, except to say that I've been really looking into the whole issue of how to pass on the perennial wisdom in new ways, because the old ways seem to have so many fault lines, and we've seen it in the last, decades, teacher after teacher and organization after organization, coming unstuck through power imbalances and exploitation of students and all sorts of things like that. And I've had a long history in the spiritual field, a lot of which was quite unpleasant, really. And I also discovered through creating the new website, The End of Seeking, or the impulse behind it was to simplify the whole search, because we've got enormous amounts of complexity, all of which are components of the search, but are not necessarily fundamental to it, at least in the beginning. And I wanted to give, both someone just starting out on the path and also those who maybe have stalled in their spiritual progress or feel stalled in their spiritual progress, to take the reins back, to take the power back in terms of discovering for themselves what it's all about, rather than relying on external forces so much. So using what's available, and there's an enormous amount of teachings and disciplines and doctrines available, but instead of outsourcing one's own autonomy, to have enough tools to be able to stand firmly in one's own ground, knowing what the pitfalls are and what the objectives are and what the lay of the land is, so that people can really do it under their own steam in a much more independent way. And so I've been looking into how the perennial wisdom can be shared, and the different ways it can be shared, and the different formats it can be shared. And I'm very keen to find a way for the old hierarchical structures to dissolve in some way, so that it's a friendship-based exchange rather than a hierarchical one so much. And that doesn't mean that there can't be respect for the teacher and love for the teacher and so on, but the dynamic, that kind of encrusted guru-disciple dynamic, somehow gets dissolved a bit or broken down a bit. So that was really the impetus from my side, why I wanted to talk to you guys, because of all your experience and because of the range of knowledge and understanding that you have.
Thank you. Amir, did you want to jump in here?
You brought up a lot of, I've been thinking as you were speaking about my experience of what you're talking about, and maybe just as to set the ground for where I come from. So I've been interviewing over the last year. I interviewed 36 spiritual exemplars of different spiritual paths and traditions, and was really the first one that I interviewed about a year ago. And I have a group of 14 core researchers who are watching those interviews. So I conducted over 100 interviews with those 36 exemplars. And the co-researchers have been watching those interviews. And now, as we are kind of wrapping up that part of the research, I interviewed each of the 14 people. And yesterday I interviewed one of them who said something very interesting. She said, I feel like after watching all these different exemplars, I feel like they're all standing in a circle around me, pointing their fingers or arrows, like coming from all different directions toward me. So they're really like showing me the different angles. All of them are pointing in the end completely at me. And that's kind of the ultimate point that I have to rely on, and where the real search is happening. So that was an interesting way of looking at, how should we say, using the existence of different traditions and different teachers in a way that actually very much facilitates one's own independent search, rather than relying on one of those paths and one of those teachers. So that's an interesting way of looking at what's possible now that we are exposed to so many different teachers and paths. So that's kind of something that's very fresh on my mind. And I'm thinking of how to use that fact that we have such access to so many different possibilities in a way that, rather than dilutes, actually facilitates our own search.
So thank you. The two responses occur to me. One is that I'm curious about how you would describe these 14 co-researchers that you were just describing, that you're working with in this. I believe this is still part of your dissertation research. Is that correct? Yeah,
that's correct.
And the second point is one that has eluded my mind at the moment. So let's go with that first part, and maybe the second part will come back to me.
So these are 14 people, or I should start half a year ago, when I finished about half of the interviews, or I finished the interviews with about half of the exemplars for my research. And I decided I would take a break and a pause and analyze the interviews I had done up to that point in order to continue with a much greater focus and precision in terms of what questions I was looking to answer.
Okay.
And I started analyzing the interviews, and I found that really difficult. And now looking back, I think the reason I found it so difficult was because I couldn't extract myself. I couldn't take the few steps back from the interviews that I had to do in order to do a proper analysis. I just couldn't do that because I was so involved and so much part of what was happening in those interviews that I couldn't take those few steps back. Mm-hmm. So, and then it occurred to me, I shared a couple of the interviews with a neighbor who lived just like 100 meters away from me up the road, and a friend, and then I also shared them with my wife, a couple of interviews, and then I had conversations with them. And I realized that what was coming out of these conversations was so much richer and more nuanced in terms of the different impressions and ways of looking at these exemplars, much more richer and more nuanced than I could have arrived at myself. So I thought, wow, this is really how I want to do this analysis with a group of people. And I put out a message that I'm looking for people with experience on the spiritual path and with some experience in qualitative research, who are willing to commit to 6 hours a week for 2.5 months. So that was mid-December, and I asked until the end of February. And I thought I would be lucky if I have like 4 to 6 people who would be willing to give that much time and effort. And I ended up with 14 people who were willing to make that commitment. And I divided them into 2 groups, and they watched interviews. So they watched 4 interviews every 2 weeks, and then we met every other week to discuss their impressions. And came the end of February, and I asked if anybody was willing to continue for another 2.5 months. And to my surprise and delight, all 14 said that they were interested in continuing. So we're kind of in a week or so, we're going to end the second half of that process. And I'm now collecting impressions from all of them. And people say that the process has deeply impacted them, that it was a powerful kind of crash course in spirituality. And that it was a significant spiritual process for them. So based on their testimonies, you know, I'm like realizing what a powerful practice this has been and the potential in it.
Got it. Well,
Could I just say something in
please.
response? I think also, Amir, what really struck me when we spoke is that you talked about the impact it had on you personally, and I think the guys would maybe really enjoy to hear, you know, because that was the very significant part of the whole process for you, not just for your colleagues, but for you very personally.
Yeah, for sure. So I went into this research of spiritual exemplars with a very personal question, which is how to live the absolute timeless dimension in this body, with this conditioning, Israeli male conditioning, and in the complexity of relationships with other people in the world of multiplicity, which is a question I've been, I don't know if to say pondering, but contemplating, you know, for the last 30 years. And I thought, well, if I want to, one good way of engaging with this question is interviewing and speaking with, interacting with people who may be exemplars of how they do it, how it's done, how to live the absolute timeless dimension in this human body and in this world of multiplicity. So that's kind of the idea behind, that's what prompted me to go on this research. And fortunately, I was able to make it into a PhD research, and I have a supervisor who is happy to support me. Well, 3 supervisors who are supporting me in this research. And so that is how I started the research. And also in the back of my mind was the hope that I would meet somebody along the way who would, with whom I could have a teacher-student relationship, meaning if I could find somebody who could be my teacher for the next chapter in my life. And what happened during the research is that I found that the most potent, powerful, impactful, significant relationships I found or formed along the way were with people, with exemplars who spoke to me completely at eye level, related to me as a peer, and with whom a relationship of friendship, spiritual camaraderie or friendship started. And with some of them, it's definitely going on, and I hope it will continue. And the reason that happened, the reason these relationships started is because I think in some of the interviews with some of the exemplars, we experience the I-thou in between space that is created when two hearts come together, two hearts and two minds and two spirits come together in something which is beyond each of the individuals. And I realized in the process that that's really the answer to my question of how to live the absolute, timeless connection to reality in the human world and in human relationships. And that not only so that there is something mysterious and wonderful that can happen in the meeting of like-minded people, as they say, spiritual brothers and sisters, that brings heaven to earth.
Or maybe brings earth to heaven.
Yeah, or create something that is beyond that division. And that's really, I'm grateful for the opportunity I had to discover this. And I feel like, well, now this is until a year ago, I would say that meditation or meditative state was my portal, my main portal to the infinite, timeless, absolute dimension. And now I feel it's actually, there are such meetings and such relationships with other people that has become my main portal.
Well, I appreciate that. There's a couple of things that come up for me in relation to that. One, just coincidentally, we were having dinner with a friend of ours last night who is a Westerner who has been a teacher in the Tibetan tradition and at one time was a translator for Kalu Rinpoche. And he was describing for him, his relationship to the path was always the question of how do I live the path, or how do I live, I'll say my truth, or how do I live in such a way that I embody the path, as opposed to a transactional question like how do I get something out of the path, or how do I give something to the path, even. Because both sides, on the teacher side, there's sort of a notion of giving. On the student side, there's a notion of receiving. Both of them have a valence of transaction. And a different question is, how do I live the realization?
Yes.
And so it's interesting because you're calling up that question, and it was just at the dinner table, as it were, for us last night. Another thing that I want to mention, just by way of the point of view that we're coming from, Rob and I worked with a teacher very intimately for many years, Rob for 20 years and me with the same teacher for 10 years. And so we have that experience, and it was not that it was easy at all times, but it was also an experience that was integrated into ordinary life, in the sense that we had a teacher relationship, but also it was within a context of a human relationship. And in later years, like in the last 10 years with us doing a mystical positivist radio show, there's much more of a quality for us where conversation brings alive the teaching. Yes. And it doesn't happen all the time. I mean, it happens sometimes. And when it happens, there's an ineffable quality that you can't, it when it's there. It's hard to define, but it tends to happen when everyone is meeting together in a spirit of openness, as opposed to someone interviewing someone, or someone, talking about their book or their work or something, in a very narrow sort of sense. And so conversation has arisen for us as a rich ground for communion. The last thing I'll say on the point is that we, and you'll have to remind me of the terminology, but that we were talking to someone about Quaker meetings, and there's a term they use. Do you remember the term?
Describe the
It's when the meeting attains to a level of elevation.
Right. Yeah, I'm forgetting the exact term, but it's a kind of ripeness.
Yeah,
where there's an elevation, as Stuart said, of the group, shared mind, if you will.
Gathering? It's a gathering.
It's gathered. It's a meeting that is gathered.
Yeah, it's a meeting that is gathered.
That's the terminology.
And so
and people will know that meeting, that particular meeting, at that particular day, was gathered.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think it's beautiful that we all very clearly have the sense of exactly what it is we're speaking about, even though we've come to it from, in different ways and from different places. But there's a very strong sense of recognition between all of us, I think, of what we're talking about.
Well, I want to add, though, as well, I have, because it's relevant here, I think, because Amir is doing this project that he was describing, some of the feedback he was getting in terms of an academic context. And when I was doing, if you will, some breakthrough research myself in my own field of anthropological archaeology 30 years ago, or 25 years ago, with a colleague who's now a professor at Stanford University. There, we were approaching. What ended up was that there was an academic session at an academic meeting, and that was so successful that publishers were eliciting a book from us. But the way it came together was that in conversation, we went to various different senior, we had a little chutzpah, and we went to senior people in the field and said, if you wanted to talk about the exploration and investigation of sexuality, this was the topical area, in your area, which no one had ever looked at before, for the most part, how would you frame it? How would you do it? What would you say, etc.? And it led to conversations that were, in a similar way to what we're describing here, remarkable in their creativity. And I want to stress that the reason I bring this up is because I think that one of the points that is coming out of Amir's description of his interaction with his 14 co-researchers, thank you, is that when you're stepping outside of where you think you already know what's happening, where you think you already know the answer, then the only coin of the realm, if you will, is creativity.
Yes. So
that's what I think, in some ways, I'm going to frame that as that's the starting point of this conversation, as is Amir's point that there's something creative happening with these people that he's engaged to collaborate with. And I will also want to liken that to the ways in which I observed my own teacher, and I try to model myself in my relations with our little sangha, our little Tayu sangha that we have, which is to create a context where creativity is supported.
Mm.
and even celebrated when it arises in a way that leads to a meeting where we feel gathered in the Quaker sense that we were just talking about. And I'm wondering if this, Amir, you spoke of both individual conversations with your co-researchers, and I think you were suggesting that you were having meetings where a bunch of you were getting together and speaking. And I'm wondering if you could describe any relevant responses that come up for you with regard to what I'm suggesting about creativity.
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, I think it would be interesting to explore the qualities of creativity that I think is quite unique, in my experience, to a meeting in the spiritual exploration. Because you can have creativity in all different fields around all different subjects.
Sure.
And I think there are some special qualities to this creativity when it happens in a spiritual exploration. So it would be, I'd love to kind of go into that, but first just to say, yes, we have been meeting every other week. So 2 groups, so we are 6 people in one group and myself, and 7 and 8 in the other and myself.
Mm-hmm.
And we often have an exploration where everybody comes out of it, where I come out of it feeling like we've gone somewhere, we've gone together somewhere to a place of depth and insight and richness that none of us could have arrived at on their own.
Okay.
So something gets amplified and proliferates, or I don't know how to call it, but and in the best moments, there is a sense of all of us kind of listening with one ear and thinking with one mind that that is greater than the sum of its parts. But that's very rare, and I think, and when I think about it, I think that it happened to me much more often. That experience happened to me much more often in a one-to-one meeting with some of the exemplars. And I would say that with some of the exemplars, I already know, since, you know, with some of them I've been meeting, like we finished, like with Anne, we finished the kind of the formal interview part after 3 interviews. And then we have been meeting since regularly. And I already know that when we meet, that space will somehow miraculously, it's always miraculously, but almost can be expected. It will form, it will be created. With a group, it's much more unpredictable. And I think the conditions that enable that to happen are more complex, or I feel much less, I don't know if and when it will happen.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough.
Yeah,
I thought, Stuart, you actually described the conditions a little bit earlier. And I think Rob touched on them as well when you said, I don't know what you said now, but you were describing a way of listening and a way of being together where no one was trying to impose their point of view or their particular teaching or their new book project or whatever. It was an open field where there was just a sense of beingness together. And what was said was actually coming from a very deep place in each person. And then that was being responded to in the same way from other people. So there's a kind of willingness to go into the unknown together and not have to prove anything or be anyone or know anything in particular. And I think when you were talking about the Quakers, I was a Quaker briefly in my long history. And I remember, Rob, that sense of the gathering, you know, where even if nothing's being said, the unity of the energy was just beautiful, you know, and it was of an elevated kind. So I think both of you, and Amir also, you touched on the different qualities necessary for the creativity, that deep, it's like you touch into a deep well of which creativity is a part, and unity consciousness, if you like, is a part, and communion is a part. If we all manage to sort of step out of the way a bit, which is harder to do, Amir, as you said, in a group situation, where the natural instinct really is to sort of, you know, am I doing okay? And, you know, do I have to say something now or what have you? But for everyone just to kind of be able to take it easy in the situation while still being very, very, very present with it seems to be conducive to this space we're talking about happening.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
like,
Amir.
yeah, please.
I'd like to add, and that that there is a quality of intimacy and love, and even, I dare say, an erotic component in the space that's created, that can be created or formed in such a one-to-one situation, that I think is harder to occur. Yeah, it doesn't happen as easily in a group situation, and maybe that has to do with something. We can say that in a meeting between two individuals, the whole personality is also involved. So there is a sense that we're not just meeting in a kind of a formless space of unitive consciousness where we are both lost, but there's also a sense of, I have a sense of everything in me, emotional, embodied, relational, taking part in the meeting and contributing to it. And that's what makes it maybe so powerful, because it's not just an abstract, empty space, which I'm familiar with from meditation. It's a very embodied, emotional, charged, relational space that makes it so rich and full and covers all areas of experience and existence. So that's maybe, and now as we're speaking about it, I think maybe that's what gives the feeling of heaven and earth coming together in such interactions.
Nicely, well put.
Can you speak a little bit more about, you mentioned the word charged, emotionally charged, I think is the direction you were going, or what you were trying to articulate there. And so I'm curious, you know, in different spiritual traditions, there are different ways to understand the human emotional capacity. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to that, about the sense of being charged emotionally.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the best word to describe it is love. And I feel, you know, because I've been conducting these interviews via Zoom over the last year, I have a feeling of like both parties, myself and the other person, like leaning toward each other, even if we're not moving from our seats. But there is a sense of like wanting to merge with each other through the screen, and a sense of strong, almost physical, maybe not almost, physical attraction. And it's not, you know, it can happen with men and women. I'm thinking of the last person that I had that experience with, which was Ken Wilber. And it's like, we were like, I felt we were like together, sitting head to head, kind of speaking very intimately and lovingly about sharing an exploration. And it shakes you up, such an experience on an emotional level. I feel it's definitely not just kind of the high cognitive conceptual faculties that are involved in such an interaction.
Well, my teacher used to say that sex is the pleasurable rubbing of two bodies together, and he did not limit his definition of bodies to be the physical bodies. So that's how I would gloss your description here when you're bringing in the erotic aspect, because I think because human emotional interaction, even human intellectual communion, which is what I was when I was describing my experience in my own intellectual background as a PhD student. And there was in many of the conversations I and my colleague had with individual researchers, there was an aspect of intellectual communion which was extraordinary and different than I was used to feeling. So I'm gonna say that this, it sounds to me as if what you're describing is a kind of erotic slash sexual slash the pleasurable rubbing of two bodies together, however you define those bodies, as helping to facilitate a kind of elevation that the Quakers, I guess, experience on a more, I don't know if refined level is the right word to say, but in a certain kind of level. You can tell us, Anne, your experience of a gathered meeting. But since there's no, my understanding is that there's no speech involved, that nevertheless there can be a sense of communion, and I think that relates to the word gathered, that is relevant here.
Well, I was only briefly entered into the Quaker world, but I did go to some of the meetings, and it was pretty much as you described, Rob, in that you would be in a room together, and if people have questions or have something to say, then that can be included, but it's not necessary for it to be considered a complete meeting. And at a certain point, the silence gets so deep and so profound that it seems to break through the personal or the separate or the individual, and it becomes a unified field of a very, very fine level. So you're sharing in this group experience, basically, of consciousness. And it's incredibly fulfilling and renewing, because the deepest part of you is just being fed in this way. And you know that is the case, the whole room is immersed in that same quality. I don't know if that.
I want to ask you something, Anne.
Yes.
Because you told me when in our first interview, I think, about the experience you had of being in a group of 6 women. Yes. Who were together on retreat, and where for a period of weeks, or maybe more than a few weeks, there was a shared experience of communion that was beyond time and space, we could say, because whenever you saw one of those other women, you felt that connection and the space between you. So that was very interesting in the sense of, so it wasn't limited to a specific situation and specific circumstances or conditions, and that it was specifically with those 5 other women who shared the experience with you. So it was still very personal, but not limited. So it was an interesting description. Would you tell about it again, or?
Sure. If are you guys interested in?
Yeah, please.
Oh, of course.
Okay. So, well, this was when I was part of the Andrew Cohen community, and I was a relatively new student, and we, at that point, we hadn't been really brutalized by the system. You know, there was still a freshness and a tremendous aliveness and interest in the teachings, and an adventurous spirit, because we hadn't, you know, been crushed yet. And I was part of a small, we were put into different groups or hold-ons, and I was part of a small group of relatively new students. And we were on retreat with Andrew in the south of France and up in the mountains. And the retreats with him were always really beautiful. You know, the energy was beautiful, and the teachings and the environment, everything was really very, very, very beautiful. Anyway, the small group of us kind of hung out together. You weren't allowed to speak personally about, you know, anything. You were only allowed to speak about the teachings or impersonal matters. And we unusually found that we were very relaxed with each other. We seemed to form this little group where no one was trying to be the leader, no one was trying to undermine anyone else. And especially among a group of women, you know, there was just this sense of being able to just be without feeling judged or without feeling afraid of the other or worried about oneself. And Andrew called us in. He called us in to see him, and these were always usually terrifying meetings. You know, if he called you in, it usually meant that you'd done something wrong, and you were going to pay for it, pay the consequences. Anyway, so the six of us were in the room, but somehow there was no fear. You know, we seemed to just be one body and one mind, and we were prepared for whatever happened, actually. You know, we were so resting in ourselves and as part of this kind of one unit. Not that we were merged as one amorphous blob. They were very individual people, of course, but we were unified. There was a great sense of unification and individuality. So, you know, I think Andrew called it autonomy and communion, and that's exactly what it felt like. But we didn't really know those terms at that time. Anyway, he was incredibly supportive of what was going on with us. And he said, this is exactly what I've been trying to get my students, my senior students, my formal students to do. And he was very excited. And we actually had no idea what he was talking about, or at least I didn't have any idea what he was talking about. And he asked each one of us individually to describe what was happening, what our experience of this group union was. And each woman, and again, in that situation, I can't tell you how intimidating it could be to talk to Andrew, because he was ready to sort of jump down your throat at any moment. And especially with the women, you know, especially he had a bit of an axe to grind, or didn't really like women very much, I'm not sure which. And because we were new, you know, we knew we didn't know a lot. And each woman just stood in her own sort of simple beinghood, you know, not trying to outshine anyone, not trying to get Andrew's approval, not de-emphasizing their own personhood. You know, women either kind of try and be strong and out there, or, you know, they kind of collapse into themselves. It's kind of a common female thing, but each woman just stood there very calmly and just spoke what was on her mind. And each one had a slightly different impression of the situation. And the love that we shared together and that we shared with Andrew in that exchange was so exquisite and so profound. And then for weeks and months afterwards, we would get together, you know, you would see another one of the six across the room and your heart would literally explode. And you would see that her heart also would literally explode. And we would suddenly be in this field of togetherness again. And it wasn't a collusive, you're my friend kind of thing. It was simply beinghood, shared beinghood at a very elevated level, you know. And Andrew talked about it as being a sort of communal enlightenment or a group enlightenment. And it was an exquisite, you know, an exquisite thing. And it was a key to see that this is actually a possibility in the human species, you know, that we're actually capable of that level of profound intimacy, togetherness, love, autonomy, and union, you know, without having to sacrifice your independence, which often happens in the spiritual domain. So there was no lessening of your autonomy and your individuality, but without the usual separation and the usual self-protectiveness. So I think it was a very, very profound thing. And this was really the kind of core of his teaching. But of course, everything went kind of horribly wrong and so on. So,
but that's a beautiful story, and I'm interested in your reflections now on how was it that the six of you came into that place, and what, what lesson is that for all of us in terms of finding that same place with anybody?
Yeah, good question, Stuart. I mean, I think the main, at least, the field, if you like, that it came out of was that we were on retreat. So there was the energy of the retreat, Andrew's teachings and so on. We were all completely focused in that way. We weren't concerned about our normal lives or whatever else was going on. So there was a ground, if you like, a ground of meditativeness, a ground of seriousness, a willingness to explore further into the unknown, because that's what the retreats were always for, to go further than what you had gone before. So all of the and as I said, we as yet didn't have the fear of the more mature students, the longer term students who had already been through so much and weren't willing to risk in the way that maybe we newer people were. So I think those things really are significant in that there has to be, you have to have worked on your own ground of being, so you know what it is that you're trying to share with others, in a sense, even though it wasn't an effort or a trying. And a willingness to lean in, as Amir said, and to see where that's going to take you, and a kind of trust, a deep trust somehow, but not a forcing oneself to trust, but a willingness to explore with other people in that way, and a willingness to relinquish the personal, very much a willingness to relinquish the I or the me.
Well, a word that's occurring to me, and you tell me if this word applies to what you're describing, the experience of you and your compatriots, colleagues in this context, is innocence.
Yes.
You're describing, I mean, you're saying that you were different than the longer term students who are afraid to stick their necks out, as my teacher would say, for fear that they would be chopped off, their heads would be chopped off. So that innocence is a very powerful quality. And I'm wondering, beyond just agreeing with me with the one word, if you could say more about that, because it's I think that's a really powerful observation here.
I mean, I think what you're saying about innocence, I think we did fall into it innocently, and I think we were the first of all of Andrew's many students who did, and we had no idea what we were doing. So innocence was definitely a part of it. But I would not like to rely on innocence, as Stuart was bringing up. How do we integrate this into human existence? How do we make this a part of our developmental process, if you like, that this becomes
Sure.
So I don't think we can rely on innocence as a path. I think we have to create it maybe in a more deliberate fashion, but there definitely needs to be an innocence of willingness, an innocence in terms of I don't know, I want to know, I'm not sure, I'm not certain of myself, but I want to engage, I want to lean in, I'm willing to put myself forward, if you like, and I'm willing to expose my vulnerabilities. And I think that's where your word innocence strikes me.
Got it. It came to me because Stuart's my own teacher used to talk about a quality of attainment in spiritual practice that he called innocence with knowledge, that children are born innocent,
Yes.
and for the practitioner, he expressed the idea that to seek to temper innocence, not squelch it, not deny it, not repress it, but to educate it, if you will,
Yes.
Is and that's why I'm bringing this quality of innocence up, because I think that in some ways the start of the conversation, it strikes me, was implicitly, our conversation today was implicitly referencing something like innocence.
Yes. And I have to confess, I was terrified because I didn't know how to do this conversation in this way. If it was a straight interview, then I would have felt very comfortable with you guys again. But we'd changed the format. We'd actually removed all of the structures for it. So I couldn't hide behind being an interviewee, and you couldn't do the same. Not that you accusing you of hiding, but you know, there were roles that we're comfortable with. And I thought, I don't know how to do this. I have no idea how to do this. But actually, we're doing it simply because because of all of the things that we've spoken about and the way we've spoken about them. I wanted to get back to something Amir said at the beginning. You know, I was talking about this rarefied field in the gathering of the Quakers, and Amir brought it back to a very embodied sense of unity and love and connectedness. And I think that was really, really important. And I'm glad, Amir, you brought in the example of the 6 of us in France during that period, because that really was what it was. We were definitely immersed in unitive consciousness as one being, but we were also very much alive in our bodies and in our hearts and in our minds together with each other. And I think that is an incredibly important thing to emphasize, because it's not just an abstract or an absolute. It's not just an aspect of the absolute, it's also grounded in our very, very, real humanity and in our very real relatedness. And I think that's what makes it so significant. It's not away from this world. It's very much in this world and for this world. And that's what feels very important to me.
There's the image that came up to me was an image from my physics education, where we think about individual atoms, and atoms will have a nucleus and they'll have various electrons circulating in a cloud of around the atom. But when you bring atoms together to form molecules, you still have the individuality, but then there's a higher level of the electrons that then are shared across all of them. And in a way that there's a sense of that we don't lose our individuality in these moments, because individuality is still present, but there's something more that is connects us, and there are different degrees of that connection, because you can have that connection with other people in more conventional senses, but then when it becomes a larger group of people and the energy is more refined, then there's something that raises us up. And it's very palpable. We feel it together. We are one in that sense, and yet we don't lose the individuality. The individuality is just, in a sense, almost like to use a musical analogy, it's the character of a particular instrument in an orchestra, but all the instruments are playing together.
Yes, but interesting what you're saying is what individuality is present, because it's not the personal narrative self that's present. It's actually the self expressing itself with other selves expressing themselves. And I think that's what's so significant is that the personal self in this environment falls away, and the impersonal or natural self or whatever emerges, the authentic self emerges.
Yeah, I mean, I find in the Gurdjieff tradition, there's languaging around that of, you know, they'll talk about the false personality, and other traditions will talk about the egoic self. And yet those traditions point to something that Amir was saying, that when we're embodied, when we inhabit our body, we're present in our body, present in our hearts, and present in our minds, not in the sense of being obsessed with a narrative, but simply awake and attentive, that there is a sense of individuality.
Yes.
It's kind of a point of view.
Yes.
But it's not this obsessive, you know, spiral into a narrative.
Yes, exactly.
So I guess when you say the narrative drops away, that seems like a important constituent of the character of this group being that you're telling us about.
Well, I think there's not maybe room for both. There's not room for the narrative self and what can when the narrative self is not present. That there isn't, you know, there isn't really room for both, if you like.
I'm thinking, you know, I'd like to bring in something that's related to the question of innocence, or maybe I would call it freshness, and what happens over time in such a relationships. Because in a way, just like it's one thing to fall in love and have the experience of complete immersion in a very wonderful and fulfilling and elevating experience for a short period of time, limited period of time. Usually it's days or weeks or months, but usually it doesn't last more than that. And then what happens when it becomes a long-term love relationship, and your personality with all its quirks and frailties and needs comes into the picture more. And I'm also thinking about it because, you see, I experienced and am experiencing these incredible unions, experiences with people. And part of it is that we are meeting for the first time, and second and third and fourth time, but it's still, it's like a one-off meeting where it's easy to feel the experience of falling in love again and discovering each other again.
It's a great date.
What?
It's a great date.
A great date.
Sorry, I just wanted to inject some humor here.
And then I'm thinking of, you know, going to visit and spend some time with some of these exemplars. And I have to admit that it kind of scares me a bit of what will happen when we spend a few weeks together. And we meet not just speaking about, you know, sharing a spiritual exploration and moving together into unknown territory for both of us, but where we meet, you know, for coffee and hang out and go for walks together, and the whole complexity of the human condition comes into play. So what we're talking about is an exceptional, rare, very significant experience that we can have when, and part of the conditions for it are the freshness and the newness and the excitement of discovering something new together for the first time. So what happens to that when it becomes a long-term love relationship? And then the narrative self is back in the picture, unavoidably. How does that fit into this miracle?
Well, I have a response to this, and it's related to the material I was mentioning earlier. So it's not in the explicitly spiritual realm, but it's the colleague that I created this Archaeologies of Sexuality project with back in the late 90s. And, we went on to get our PhDs. She went on to become a professor. I went on to do stuff outside academia, which was appropriate for me and appropriate for her, it seems to me. Just recently, she came over for dinner. I guess it was just less than a week ago, or just a week ago. And at the university, UC Berkeley, that we both attended as grad students, and at many American universities right now, there are some controversies. I won't get into the details because it's not relevant to our conversation here. But there are reframings of understandings of what intellectual ancestors, if you will, did in the past that are being judged, and the consequences of that are playing out in the renaming of buildings and various things. So when we were doing our project together, while we had our disagreements at times, as people do, we were also very much aligned in the direction that we wanted to offer our colleagues in the discipline to consider. And we were very successful in doing that. And then the intervening 20 years have occurred, and we had this dinner recently, and we disagreed about one of the controversies that I'm alluding to here, but we did it in a way such that I could hear. I actually got that she made a point that I hadn't considered, and I was happy to acknowledge that. And I made some points that she considered, and she was happy to acknowledge those. And we she went off after the dinner late in the evening. The next morning, she wrote a thank you email. And I responded by, we had parted by saying, I'm very troubled by the way some of these judgments are visited upon, or are the product of processes in the institutional contexts that don't seem to include a wider understanding of human possibilities. And she wrote back. I alluded to that in my response to her thank you, and then she said in a response, I've been in the academia so long that I've become jaded, and thank you for bringing this up. It's not that necessarily we agreed about the particular outcome, but we got back to a place, it seemed to me, where there was no distance, even though there might have been disagreement.
Right.
It was, in other words, full and mutual respect. I understand that she's had experiences that I have not had that have informed her judgment, and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's true in the spiritual realm too. My experience, in all our 10 years of plus conversation on the mystical positivist, I don't always agree with everything that every guest says by any means. And nevertheless, when we are willing, I think Anne talked about offering vulnerability to one another. She didn't use exactly that phraseology. Then innocence emerges again, it seems to me. Freshness, or to use your word, Amir, freshness emerges again. And I'm not sure it's any different in the spiritual realm than it is in the academic realm or the, I've had 3 careers, and one of them was, a very labor in the world kind of realm, working man realm. And I don't think the way that we establish communion in any of those realms, as I look back on my life in those 3 different realms, that it's really all that different when we open our hearts to understand that the experience of another person has an authenticity that it's not that we don't have the right to question it. It would be stupid. It would be irrelevant. It would be foolish to question it. And in fact, it's worthy of respect because the universe, the deity, the God, whatever, did the universe make a mistake in creating these separate views? There's separate perspectives? No, of course not. So that's, so I'm linking that. I'm wanting to link that in response to your very good point here and question about how innocence actually manifests and how educating ourselves to return to innocence through, as Anne pointed out, vulnerability. We don't have to struggle necessarily, or there might be a struggle a little bit, as I was doing because I was impassioned with my friend I'm describing, in the sense that not that I was impassioned to tell her she was wrong, because I didn't think she was wrong, but I was impassioned to make clear that I was troubled by processes that didn't seem to have compassion baked into them. And I hope that is responsive to your question.
I just feel like I disappeared into what you were saying, Rob. I thought it was really fantastic what you were saying. I can hardly remember what it was. I just felt I was really, really with what you were saying. And I think it was really useful for Amir's question as well, because what you were describing was for him the way to be with these exemplars, or like when you're with them in a normal situation. It's that you, I think you were describing it beautifully, that the vulnerability and the willingness to let the other person be, and not impose yourself on them, but allow the whole environment to, allow yourself just to be in that environment together without trying to add anything on top, with a great sense of respect and innocence or vulnerability, as you say. I thought that was really wonderful how you described that whole thing.
There's one thing that arose for me in relationship to Amir's question in terms of intimacy with spiritual exemplars and the challenge of the long-term relationship and the arising of the conditioned self. My experience with my teacher was that just by his very nature, it was uncomfortable to be around him with a conditioned self. And it doesn't mean that it was there was strong feedback necessarily. It was almost it was an energetic thing. It's just that my conditioned self found my teacher incredibly annoying.
I'll just add here briefly that my parents really found it uncomfortable to be around him.
Yeah, both of our parents actually found it very uncomfortable. And remember, we were in a relationship with our teachers, so it was, it had that family dynamic element as well, which just added
to the discomfort.
Oh well, yeah, it just added levels and levels of discombobulation to the ordinary mind. But that's what I found was over time, the less my center of gravity was around my conditioned mind, and but was around something else, then the relationship was very natural. And that's and to the extent that my conditioned mind was the center of gravity, it became there was friction, and that heat of that friction came to be grateful for.
Mhm.
And it's still, it still comes up in Rob and me in relationship, and to the extent that if my center of gravity is around my conditioned mind, then there's friction, and I'm grateful for that. That's a wonderful quality of relationship, and that's what my experience is. That to me, that's an ideal experience with not only an intimate partner, but also a spiritual friend. That
Indeed.
and it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to fit any of the models of abuse or yelling or saying you're wrong or anything like that. It really is an energetic thing.
Mhm.
And when you can find someone that elicits that kind of discomfort for the conditioned mind, that's someone to hang on to, because it's a great gift.
Mhm.
I do want to add something here, which is that I had so many years, I've been doing spiritual practice for whatever it is, 44 years almost. And for 3/4 of that, roughly, I suppose, variation over time, reduction over time, but when I was in the presence of a powerful spiritual teacher, the powerful spiritual teacher didn't have to say boo to me. I was self-critical mind was arising in me like gangbusters, or that was the tendency, which was only just an elaboration or exaggeration of my usual mind, actually. So it was when I knew something was different about my experience of life, when that wasn't true in the way that it had been true for many years. We had a good friend. Our teacher had a good friend, and he was a good friend to me for many years. A teacher named Lee Loswick.
Oh, I love Lee. I spent a couple of years with Lee. Sorry, go on.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, I didn't even know that, but in any event, we're still very good friends with many members of his community. But in any event, we had the privilege and pleasure of spending time, as Amir was saying, having coffee with him. Except, of course, I wouldn't have coffee because I don't drink coffee. But the equivalent,
Tea.
Tea or whatever, and he never criticized me the way that my mind was inviting me to criticize myself. And in that process, I realized, oh, there's something for me to see here. That was relatively far along in my own evolution, if you will. But the real critiques, the critiques that teachers offer only land if we resonate with them internally, it seems to me. And so part of the process is to realize that is an imposition, if you will, that we ourselves give energy to and don't have to give energy to. So I guess that's another way I would respond to Amir's very good question.
Well, I'd like to say something more along the same line. which is it occurs to me now as we're speaking about it, that being aware that we are coming into such situations with our narrative or conditioned self can actually, maybe we can say, is actually a good thing, because it makes, I can say for myself, it makes me feel more vulnerable, more in the unknown, or open to something which is beyond my narrative conditioned self, rather than feeling, well, I know how, you know, I got it. I know how to create the conditions. I know what's going to happen. You know, no worries, mate. You know, it's going to happen one way or another. No, I don't go into such situations with that feeling. I go into like, well, I really hope my conditioned self will not mess it up. And that can be a good thing, to keep that vulnerability, or maybe I could say humility, in the face of what we want to create, what we hope would like to happen between us, but not feeling in control of it. So being open for it, rather than confidently trying to do something, create it. So does that make sense to you? I'm kind of
It does. Yeah, no, it absolutely makes sense. You're also reminding me the other day in my meditation, my nightly meditation, I'm familiar with a lot of Buddhist terminology, and there's a pairing in some of the Mahayana literature of great faith and great doubt. And I was reflecting on essentially some of the stuff that we've just been discussing around the question you raised, Amir, but more widely as well. And I realized, oh, I don't feel like I know what other people are supposed to do, even though people relate to me as a teacher. I don't feel like I know what their experience is supposed to be. And I realized, oh, I could call that modesty. And then if I call it great modesty as a direction to move towards, then I have to pair it with great certainty. And I've developed a kind of certainty that arises when it arises about what I'm supposed to do, what is perfect for me to do in a given moment. And that's great. And that I was pairing as great certainty. So great certainty and great modesty. And I think that these poles help us, because we realize they help remind us that we don't exist in one spot ever. We're always moving around, moving back and forth between great faith and great doubt. Or in this case, you know, to whatever extent it's useful, great modesty and great certainty.
I have a slightly different take, or maybe just maybe a parallel take, Rob, to what you just said. And it's related to Amir's dilemma of how to be with these spiritual colleagues and mentors and exemplars. I think we can overcomplicate it. One thing I wanted to say, when you're with these people, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be this amazing, you know, elevated discussion every time, because life is ordinary, and most of life is ordinary. And as you know, being with Lee Lozowick, you know, and hanging out with the group, it was the most ordinary thing, beautiful, but absolutely ordinary. And so not to impose that something special has to happen all the time or at all, you know, because it's just living, it's just life being lived, and life being lived in companionship and in mutuality. So you can take a lot of pressure off yourself by not having expectations of how it should be. And then how one can be, and I think, Amir, you talked about this as well just before, Am I promoting or protecting the narrative or conditioned self? Is that what I'm presenting? Is that what I'm offering? Or am I offering my vulnerability, which can include, the screaming, conditioned, uncomfortable, or insecure conditioned self? But you can be vulnerable about that. And so as long as there's this kind of vulnerability and simplicity and realness and honesty, you don't need to know anything more than that. You don't have to have any concepts to carry you through, if you like.
Mhm.
For me, when I start to have concepts about, maybe certainty or modesty, or what, I'm complicating my own nothingness somehow. I don't need any more than just to be, whatever that is. It can be discomfort or insecurity or pleasure in the other person or what have you. So even if the conditioned self is present, that can be included. But I know that I'm deeper than I'm deeper than that. There's a greater reality to me than that, and that's what I'm offering. That's what I'm being. That's what I'm sharing. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, the only utility of language is to point to the moon, to use the Buddhist
Right.
metaphor, and that's what these words
Yes.
are offered to do.
Yes.
But they only, if the moon's dropped below the horizon, not much point in bringing it up.
Well, I find a lot of the Buddhist things really useful to me as well.
Got it.
One of the ideas that I was reminded of in this conversation was the teaching I get from my music teacher, my shakuhachi teacher, about a sound is very interesting when you're right on the edge of what's possible. And so in a flute, particularly a shakuhachi, which requires very precise embouchure of the mouth, they'll have me, sort of bend the flute down and reduce the breath to the point where I have no idea if I can keep the sound up. And it's very, for the mind that wants to control, it's very, very annoying because it's like I don't want to lose the sound. But that's the only place where it gets interesting and where there's possibility. And
Right.
he'll say that audiences, if an audience member, hears and figure out what you're doing, they lose interest. And so as an artist, it's necessary to always keep changing and always keep moving and changing where the energy is in the body, changing the subtle vibrations so that there's this alive quality that comes out in the sound. And that comes up for me in this conversation because we can, the conditioned mind is sort of like the safe sound, and we have to, to keep things fresh and to keep things alive, we have to make those efforts of, as it were, jumping off the cliff, jumping into free fall, taking the risk that we'll end up somewhere we have no idea what we're doing.
I think it's a great metaphor, fantastic metaphor. Yeah.
Well, and it touches, you mentioned two things which I think are really, I resonate with. One is being out of control, and the other is taking a risk. So we could say that the conditions that enable this miracle to happen always, I think, maybe we can say that, always involve being somewhat out of control and taking some risk, in the sense of going beyond the comfort zone or the familiar ground. Yes, that just occurred to me as you were speaking, that these are key elements in my experience.
Yeah, I do. I want to be we can understand being out of control, the colloquial way of understanding that as, oh, it's like I'm a madman, I'm gonna go crazy, or I have no limits. And in my musical practice, what I've found that's interesting is that my mind wants to control, and and when it does, it tends to express in the body as tension. And when, like, my teacher will have me play from different parts of my body, like, to play from my lower back, or to play from my tailbone, or and so when I switch the source of control, in a way, something very organic arises. And so in the sense, just so people aren't confused, out of control doesn't mean that we're reckless. In a sense, we're shifting the locus of control, and control then becomes not really the right word. We're switching the locus of expression, and then something natural can emerge from parts of ourselves that our minds don't really don't have words for, really.
Yeah, and I think that being somewhat out of control in the way you're describing also means that there is a certain quality that is expressed, let's say in the sound of the shakuhachi, that expresses, or that lets the world know that feeling of being somewhat out of control. And I know that in conversations, when my voice or the other person's voice gets that quality of like somewhat trembling, somewhat insecure, hesitant, long pauses, kind of not sure how to, sometimes I feel my own lips moving, kind of wanting to express something, and I don't know what they're trying to express. So that's kind of what happens. That's what is enabled by the sense of being out of control, insecure, not knowing, open to something which is beyond the familiar and in our control, beyond what's in our control.
Well, you remind me of a concept that our teacher was fond of articulating, which was he thought that a principle in spiritual practice is to seek optimum randomity. Optimum randomity. So that means that it's enough so that we don't feel, it's enough random exposure to the world that we don't feel fully in control in the way that the egoic stories that we listen to would have be real. And we don't expose ourselves to levels of random input and impression food that would be too much, that would retard actually our education.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what, in our tradition, a spiritual school is for, is to help create a context where that is more likely to be present, no guarantees, but more likely to be present than in the ordinary world. And eventually, of course, the practitioner comes to be able to find that balance on the fly, wherever one finds oneself. But it's still, as you're saying, as you both are saying, it's still a matter of taking a risk, putting yourself in the way of risk, just to a greater or lesser extent. And because that's where, to return to the creativity I was talking about earlier, that's the only place where creativity lives. And as an artist, Anne, I'm sure you can tell us about that a little bit.
Well, I think what everyone seems to be pointing to is, in terms of risk and so on, the risk is really being present, being absolutely present and not knowing, so you're fully present. But the conditioned or narrative self is all about control, all about trying to control its image to the other, all about trying to control the environment and how to navigate the environment. So if you allow yourself to be fully present with what is, there's no room there for that controlling mechanism. There just isn't. There isn't room for both. There's only room for one. Mm-hmm. And I think it can all be reduced down to this radical simplicity of, and that's where the risk comes in, because the risk to be here is a very big risk, because it means you are vulnerable. There is innocence. You haven't got anything to hold on to. And there's just whatever arises. There's just what happens. There's just as we're finding, there's just the response back and forward to one another. So it's a very, there's a simplicity to it, but there's also a raw riskiness to it, because you've got no protection. You've got no protection for that narrative self, for the conditioned self. And so in terms of art, Rob, yes, the same thing applies. It's like, I know these different places in myself where I work from, if you like. And if I want to create a very mundane work of art, I approach it in a very mundane way. And the results are very predictable. If I'm just, if I need to produce something for a show and I'm in a hurry or whatever, I don't give it my full attention or my full presence, then I turn out something very ordinary that I'm not satisfied with, almost inevitably. And almost inevitably, the painting refuses to work, and I end up having to do 1,000 times more effort to bring it into some kind of something or other than I would if I just kind of waited until I was ready to give it my all in the first place. So the best work I've ever done comes out of that space of not knowing, an absolute risk, and going where I've not been before, even though my mind is convinced that that's the wrong thing to do and it's going to be a catastrophe. But something deeper than that is pushing me to try something radical, which will be a kind of make or break of the whole thing. And that's when some magic happens. But you have to it's like a tightrope, and you have to be willing to actually leap off the tightrope and see what happens. So so the process of creating art is also, like with your music, Stuart, is a great metaphor, because the more you're in the picture controlling and trying to get a result from a very known place, the least creativity is involved and the least aliveness and magic is involved.
I'm reminded of our teacher would describe the spiritual work as learning to live one's life as a work of art.
Beautiful.
And this conversation about what it means to take a risk with art is exactly precise allegory.
It really is. It really is. But then you're absolutely in life. Sorry, Amir, I'll just say one more thing. Then you're absolutely in life. There's no sense of deadening or the freshness, Rob, that you talked about. There's no lack of freshness. It's completely fresh in each moment, because there's no returning to the past and there's no moving forward from where you are, from what is. And so that is the life. And then in terms of every relationship and every interaction coming from that place, doesn't have to be anything special, but it's completely alive, and everyone knows it because you're there, with everything. So sorry, Amir, what were you going to?
Well, I was thinking, because both of you spoke about situations as artists, as a musician and a painter, where it's only you with the material, with the world and the and your instrument or your canvas, and that's another that brings. I'm not so familiar with such situations, and actually I use interact. So I know a big difference in myself between when I am invited to give a talk and I go on stage and give a lecture, versus when I give a very short talk and ask the audience to ask me questions and then respond to the questions. And really, it's a very, there's a very big difference in my experience. I feel I am much more in that creative, unknown, open space, and the audience gets a much better version of me when I'm in interaction, because it brings me to a place where I have to kind of be completely fresh in response to what's coming my way. And that's kind of and that happens also in dialogue with another person, is you don't know what the next step would be. While when you are an artist, you don't actually have that advantage of being dependent on somebody else and on the interaction. So that's another level of challenge
Oh, the art talks back to you. No, the art does talk back, and it gives you a very clear feedback. I mean, there's no question. It's as direct as, you know, your audience falling asleep on you. Honestly, it's a very alarming mirror.
How is that? Say some more about it.
Well, I think I did in response to Rob. If I want to create mundane work, I come from a very mundane place, and that's what you get. You are literally creating your interiority. So, you know, if there's nothing much happening, or you're not giving it that the completeness of yourself, or that aliveness in the moment where you're risking everything. And in that risking everything, and I think this circles back to what we started out with, maybe, in that risking everything, it's not just you personally risking. In the very risking, you're actually, I know this in the art side of things, but I think it's true for what we're talking about in spirituality, is that you become engaged with a higher something or other. You energetically engage with a different force, or a larger force, or something like that. And so in art, when I'm prepared to take those major risks, I know I'm engaging with a force beyond me. And I know that the force beyond me is capable of creating work that I am not capable of creating out of myself, my limited self. But if I allow the limited self to give way to this other possibility, then magic can literally, and I'm astounded. I'm astounded because I know the secret is, I know I can't do that. I know I don't have those skills, but something has those skills. And I think in the same way, in the kind of unity or spiritual camaraderie or friendship we're talking about, when we're able or willing to take those risks and be vulnerable and be present, we're actually engaging a force far greater than ourselves, which is really a divine and sacred thing.
The word invocation comes to mind.
Yeah, indeed.
This is wonderful, because the connection of taking that risk, making ourselves vulnerable, is an invocation of the higher into.
Yes. And then you can feel the sacred. As you were speaking, Stuart, it literally descended. Yeah. It was a descent of that very thing you were talking about. And I always love that phrase of Jesus. I think it was Jesus, whenever two or more of you are gathered in my name, you know, when that's the invocation. It's like, and we're not these limited separate beings, you know, no matter how convinced we are of the fact, we're actually the same as and immersed in that very field that we're invoking.
Well, I'm wanting to, from precisely this point that you're making, and in fact, the way you even expressed it with the Christian New Testament, in terms of whenever two or more of you gather in my name, I am there. I'm intrigued to go back to Amir's PhD project, where he somehow had the inspiration to bring in these interlocutors, these people to respond, and in a way that I mean, it must have been quite overwhelming, I'm imagining, in a lot of ways, for you to engage in these conversations and to help you focus. So that's one of the things I'm imagining you were looking for, is by bringing in these 14 people, you were trying to, or seeking help in focusing on what you could actually do and say as a coherent project. And I think there's something interesting going on there. So I don't know if something comes up to say about that, but I'd love to hear it if there is.
Yeah, I can say that a few very interesting, significant things from a research point of view happened as a result of engaging 14 other people in the process.
Mm-hmm.
One is that the response, so different people responded very different. Of these 14 co-researchers responded very differently to some of the exemplars. So for example, there were some exemplars that I felt I didn't really connect with, and that the interview was quite, how should I say, dull, or not that profound.
You weren't
And
engaged, at least.
yeah. And then some of my co-researchers say, well, that was the most powerful interview in all the interviews I've seen. So I'm like, that really revealed to me my own positionality and biases, and enable broadening the scope of how spiritual transmission happens, and what different people different people respond differently and experience spiritual transmission differently. And that, I think, is a very significant information to realize this. And speaking of spiritual transmission, I'm reminded of one of the co-researchers who listened to an interview I had with a Catholic nun, an elderly, very passionate, powerful exemplar. And he told us all that he first read the transcript and he wasn't that impressed. You know, he said, well, she basically said what I would expect an elderly Catholic nun to say. And then he watched her say the same words on in the interview, on the recording. And he said he was blown away by the depth of conviction and faith and the light in her eyes and the dynamic expression. So there is something also about learning about, I think I'm touching on two aspects of spiritual transmission that became a lot clearer to me thanks to the different takes of the 14 co-researchers. And also, I think I'm saying something about my own positionality and how important it is in such a research to engage other people so that you see how different people respond to different things and how different exemplars affect differently different people. And I think that the other thing that I think is very important, I actually think of writing a paper based on the experience of those of the 14 participants, which would be called qualitative research as a transformative practice, because there was something in the full involvement of these 14 people. So they analyzed the transcripts, they watched the interviews, and wrote intuitively, freely their impressions, subjective impressions of the exemplars. And then we met and spoke about their experiences, and the discussion really took all of us to another level of understanding and connecting with each of the exemplars. So that was a very full kind of research methodology of research that had a very profound effect on each of us involved in the process. and really can be considered a transformative spiritual practice.
Well, thank you. Just to get back into the detail that you just mentioned, which I think is fascinating about the co-researcher who said that the words on the page were dull or uninteresting, and the actual expression of those words were another thing altogether. I'm wondering if you yourself went back to watch that particular interview yourself, and after having heard this feedback, I'm just curious if you saw something different if you did this.
Well, I have to say I was very deeply impacted in that interview with that nun.
And at the first part, yeah, okay.
Yeah, to start with, and I actually had, and in the second interview with her, I told her, I said, I don't know if you could see it on through the Zoom, but I had tears running down my face for a big part of the interview. And she asked me, do you know why that is? And I thought about it for a minute, and I said, I think it was the power of your authenticity. And she said, I think it's something different. I think that for people like us who are seeking answers to the big questions of life, when we encounter something so as simple and as direct as what I was describing to you, we are deeply touched. It's the simplicity that really brings us together and melts our hearts. And I agreed wholeheartedly with how she described it.
That's a lovely insight.
That is, we are getting close to the end of our time. We have about 4 minutes left, so that's certainly one wonderful place to come to in this. And I just would like to leave it open for anyone else with any closing comments or observations on this experiment we conducted together.
Well, I think it was really beautiful what happened between all of us. I mean, I given that we were thrown into the mix, with no preparation and, no history between us for this kind of thing, that I feel very touched by what happened. And I've felt very privileged anyway to be part of this group experiment and the spiritual friendship and camaraderie that it showed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we really experimented with what we were talking about. So we were not just talking about it, we were also tasting what we were talking about. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. And there's nothing better than a good meal, really. And
and
in the fourth way, impression food is everything, really.
and I appreciate when we came around to this idea of invocation, I appreciated that because we try to do that with our podcast conversations, is in trying to invoke something, but we don't know what it's going to be. We don't know, and like you said, Amir, we don't know how it's going to land with people. So well, given that we are in California, Amir is in Israel, and Anne is in Sydney, that the sun is never setting on this conversation.
Oh, did you think of that earlier? Was that spontaneous?
It was.
Very good. Very good.
I didn't.
Bravo.
I hadn't thought of that one before this moment. So we just absolutely love to thank you for making this possible. This has been a lovely conversation,
and I look forward to more such conversations.
We'd love to continue this experiment because
We'd love to. We'd love to. And thank you for being so open to it and for inviting us back. Thank you so much.
We have found that when we've done group conversations like this, that it's a very interesting and it's a very different space when everyone knows how to create that space or has a sense for creating that space or a willingness to. Very interesting things come up, and it's a different format than you get from just like a one-on-one conversation.
Yeah.
Indeed.
So until next time.
Until next time.